Hello, everyone. This is Joe Tucker, President of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and welcome to our official podcast, The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. We're here today with a special episode dealing with Venezuela, on the record, with two of my good friends and two members of the Academy, Stan Garnett, who's in Colorado, and my good friend, Brian Gover, who's Dean of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers and is in Toronto. Gentlemen, there's a lot to cover here, and I want to know where to begin. I'm going to pick you first, Dan, because you're at the top of my box here. You are our resident expert in Central and South America, having traveled there for quite a bit. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in South America before we start talking about Venezuela?
Sure, Joe. Thanks very much. I've been a member of the Academy for almost 25 years. I've been very involved in Latin American issues over about the last 15 years and have chaired the subcommittee involving Latin America for the Academy. I've talked to a number of my colleagues and contacts there since the invasion. I am well aware of the point of view of a lot of folks in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and I've also got some thoughts about the legality of the last few days.
Brian, you're north of the border, and all of this saber rattling has been going on about Greenland and even Canada. And you're going to offer us a little bit of perspective from north of the border in that great, great country of Canada. You know how much I love Canada. What are you guys saying up there, Brian, about what we're doing down here?
There is concern and disappointment, Joe. And let me add as well that I've been to Argentina and Chile with Stan on an Academy outreach mission back in 2019, where we were speaking to lawyers in both Chile and Argentina about the rule of law, how it could be advanced. And even in 2019, of course, we had the aftershocks of the Pinochet regime in Chile, and we had the instability in Argentina, yet we had hopeful people who wanted to have a better system of justice in their countries. And that's why this is such a disappointment to me personally, but more importantly for Canadians. We've come to question whether our neighbor to the south really is the shining city on the hill. You know, that metaphor we always thought was more than just a paean to American exceptionalism, that it had to do with America's moral leadership and moral integrity on the international stage. And we see that as being called into question by what's happened in Venezuela and also by the rhetoric concerning Greenland and Canada.
Well, Brian, let me push back for a moment on that. Maybe, Stan, you want to weigh in on this. We can all agree that Maduro was a dictator. Can we agree on that?
We sure
Yes.
can.
Yep.
And we could agree no different than we had to get Pinochet out of Chile. We needed to get Maduro out of Venezuela. Can we agree on that?
Well, I think that the guiding principle of international law still has to be respect for sovereignty, and there has to be some, not to use the communist jargon of the Cold War, but there has to be some right to self-determination here. And what we do, I think, should be on the level of soft diplomacy. And that's really what the Academy's been engaged in promoting the rule of law. It's not a matter of gunboat diplomacy and applying the principle that might is right. I don't know if we can do that properly anymore, especially when we talk about replacing dictators in one breath, and then we talk about essentially grabbing resources with the other breath. I'm not sure we can do that, Joe.
To that. But Stan, you'd have to agree with me that soft diplomacy has not necessarily worked in Latin America. And you could disagree.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that. I think a definition of work is critical to focus on, Joe, in terms of what are we actually trying to accomplish. Maduro and the Maduro regime have been a nightmare for the Venezuelan people and for all the surrounding countries for many years. One of the things Americans often don't understand is that, for example, Colombia has a huge frontier with Venezuela. Colombia has been dealing with a huge influx of immigrants from Venezuela for many years now because of the collapse of the economy there and the social problems there. All of those things matter to all of those countries, frankly, more than even to the United States. But I think the issue that has to be focused on, particularly for our organization and our emphasis on the rule of law, is where does this stand from a legal perspective? Without jumping right to what do we need to do, how do we make this work, when I've got a lot of thoughts about that, there's no question that a invasion like this, seizure of a head of state, removal of him to prosecute in the United States violates the U.S. Constitution, the War Powers Act, traditional principles of criminal prosecution, extradition, etc. And now, admittedly, these are complicated issues in the American history since World War II under Truman, Johnson, Kennedy, etc., and Nixon are complicated. But there's no doubt that all of this has violated the rule of law, both under the U.S. Constitution and U.S. statutes and under international principles. That's a concern because if we're coming to an area where simply one head of state, the president of the United States, can say, this is what I want to do and I'm going to go do it without regard for any legal framework, that's a huge problem.
Let me push back on that. There were no complaints when Obama killed Osama bin Laden, when we went into a country and took out Osama bin Laden. What's the difference between that and this?
Well, there were actually some complaints that I heard from that. I mean, there was certainly, different views. Osama bin Laden was not a head of state, for one. Number two, you're dealing there with the assassination of a person, which, again, there is a long American tradition of these kinds of executions, which I think are not legal under the constitutional framework that we have. But it's a different matter from seizing a head of state and bringing him back to the country, to the United States, which is basically kidnapping.
And Joe, there's a more reality to the air of a claim that, Osama bin Laden's case, he was the architect of the murder of 3,000 Americans. And he was a wanted man to his knowledge. He was someone who was a terrorist and, recognized as such by almost all members of the international community. He was in a different position than an elected head of state. And, to that extent, I think other actors on the global stage can understand how that would be in a different category than a head of state like Maduro, as terrible a man as he may have been, causing the exodus of 25% of his population, causing the reduction in the standard of living, all of that, imprisoning a large percentage of his population in relative terms, all of those things. And no one is going to say that he was elected properly in 2019 when Juan Guaido should have been elected, or most recently when Machado or her proxy should have been elected in 2024.
Well,
Joe,
go ahead.
sorry. I was going to say one thing, and I've been dialoguing with a number of folks on this. Whatever one thinks of the assassination of Osama bin Laden, the capture of Maduro, etc., what I think all of this illustrates is huge problems with the framework for international law and American constitutional law about when force can be used, how it can be used, and what's the justification. And I think what's happened is the Trump administration has filled that vacuum because there's not clear guidance there and made the decision to move forward with this. That's what concerns me as a lawyer, as a member of the Academy, and as a person that cares a lot about what happens throughout Latin America.
So are you suggesting, Stan, without congressional authority, there was something impermissible with the administration doing what it did and in the way it did it?
Yes. Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Well, I think, first of all, it's been really interesting for me to watch. I mean, the problems with the legality of this occur on several different levels. The most articulate spokesperson for the administration has been Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is a very smart guy, and he's clear about what he's trying to say. His justification for what happened has totally been that there was an indictment against Maduro, and we were simply going to get the bad guy to bring him back to justice. Well, the problem is you don't get to do that. You can't simply invade a country and seize someone to bring them back to prosecute them. You have to have an extradition treaty. You don't have jurisdiction to do it. And the process of extradition is well established. Without an extradition process, doing that is essentially kidnapping, and that's what's occurred. Now, you could argue that with a nation as failed as Venezuela has been, that having to have extradition in place is difficult because it's never going to happen, and how's it going to be agreed to,
I
et
was going to
cetera.
ask that question because in that scenario where we have an administration like Maduro, it's not like his government is going to honor an extradition treaty to send him to America to be prosecuted.
Right, and I think what needs to happen, there's different problems with the legality here, problems from an American constitutional perspective, which we could talk about for quite a while, problems from an international law perspective. I think internationally, the United Nations, the international law framework needs to have a clearer guidance for how to deal with somebody like Maduro without the other traditional opportunities. Simply permitting self-help out of one head of state, as we've seen, can't be consistent with the rule of law.
What do you say about that, Brian?
I agree with Stan. I don't think that you can have self-help engaged in by one country, and it points to the need for robust international organizations like the United Nations. It points to the need to consider consequences. And my fear is that this sets an example for other countries to consider as being appropriate. You know, how do we stop China? How do we stop Russia from trying to use the same example? Unquestionably, the US has greater strength than either of them in a military sense. But I worry about the future. I worry about diminishing the authority of international organizations, diminishing the respect given to international legal principles. And I fear what other countries are going to do, pointing to this example. I think in decades to come, this could be seen as a foolish action taken by the U.S. That's a concern I have.
Dan, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Let me add one kind of footnote on that. One other, I mean, again, there's so many different levels to analyze what's going on. One of the most interesting has been to look at it, put aside the legal framework and look at it from a foreign relations perspective. What are we doing here? How does this fit in? The reference to the 1823 Monroe Doctrine has been very interesting to me. Because the Monroe Doctrine
is called now the Monroe.
The Monroe, yeah. You know, the Monroe Doctrine was developed, frankly, as a fairly enlightened concept in the early 19th century as a way of making sure that the United States could figure out some principle for reacting to European intervention in the New World, which was all over the place, you know, with the most extreme example being the French invasion of Mexico in the 1860s and establishing an emperor, et cetera. The Monroe Doctrine has become outdated after World War II, given the new multilateral system that was set up between democracies then that did away with the idea of spheres of influence and said, we want to have a system that promotes appropriate democratic systems of government throughout the world. If, in fact, what's happening here is the U.S. is abandoning that and now recommitting to a hemispheric, you know, zone of influence, which, as Brian indicated, means that China will be tempted to do the same thing in Asia and Russia in Europe. I think that's very dangerous. It's not a legal issue per se, Joe, as some of these other things are, but it's certainly a concern for what the future holds for us and our children.
Just as a footnote, some historians and political scientists have suggested that the whole concept of the Monroe Doctrine and the allegiance that it developed was one of the precipitating factors for World War I and World War II, where you have these smaller countries aligning themselves with larger countries. And that's what happened then with World War II, in addition to the other issues that happened there. But you had, you know, Japan thinking that it could exercise a Monroe Doctrine in going into China and other places. So that's a concern that has been raised also. But Stan, how do you think this plays into the larger role of America in Latin America when what we've done in Colombia? Because again, Maduro was not liked with
Yeah.
in Venezuela. So I'm curious as to whether or not this has been a welcome thing on one front, but a concerning aspect on another front.
Yeah, and I've talked with friends in Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Mexico about it, and they are quite sophisticated and approach this situation with, shall I say, a wry sense, not sense of humor, but perspective on what's going on. There is a long tradition of in Latin America of seeing the United States as wanting to come in and plunder the resources of Latin American countries. That was part of what happened with Allende in 1973 in Chile because of the fear of nationalization of the copper and mining industries. And of course, Trump has articulated that's exactly what the primary motivation here is to get the oil resources. So
it wasn't the cocaine boats that he was bombing. I say that
maybe
sarcastically.
yeah, they might have had oil on them.
Yeah.
You know, the Mexican Constitution of 1918, after the Mexican Revolution, was specifically drafted to prevent the kind of plundering of resources by Americans that had gone on in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So in many respects, I think the sophisticated view in Latin America is Maduro was a problem. Nobody's going to shed any tears over him being gone personally. Number two, his regime is a problem. Let's really see what happens with that now that he's gone personally. Number three, there go the gringos again, coming in, trying to seize all of our stuff and enrich themselves and their buddies like they've been doing in Latin America since about the early 1800s. There's a defining book in Latin America that everybody reads called The Open Veins of Latin America. That was written by an Uruguayan writer. It's wonderful, really well done, about how the entire approach of Spain, Portugal, and eventually England and the United States with these countries has been simply to come in, plunder, take as much as they can, and then leave and let everybody fend for themselves. That's sort of what happened with Allende. One of the interesting things there was an elected Democratic president was deposed, eventually killed. He committed suicide and replaced with a dictator who, eventually may have been more or less moderate, but ruled pretty brutally for quite a period of time because the United States had no particular plan about how to replace Allende with anybody democratic. So we'll have to see what happens with all of that. But I think nobody is terribly surprised in Latin America to see this happen. They worry about what the impact is going to be on their individual countries.
And it wasn't just America, it was the UK as well that was close to Pinochet. Look at the connection between Margaret Thatcher and Augusto Pinochet. And I've been smiling, Stan, remembering our visit to the Chilean Constitutional Court. And we left after being greeted by the president of the Constitutional Court to a demonstration outside because the Constitution that court was upholding was the Pinochet era Constitution that privileged property rights over human rights.
That's right. And Brian, as a footnote on that, a very liberal government was then elected in Chile in 2021. They tried to impose a new constitution to replace the Pinochet constitution, and it was defeated. So, these are deep issues there.
Weren't you down in Chile, Stan, helping with the writing of the Constitution there?
I was after our trip, and there's an expert at the University of Colorado, Dean Jim Anaya, who's an expert on indigenous people's rights, and he was. I enlisted his help to advise the progressive government on the new constitution, which eventually was not passed. But these are all issues that have to be resolved by these countries going forward.
Well, hope springs eternal that out of these lemons and onions, we can make lemonade and onion soup. My concern is that we don't have a plan, or I don't see a plan being executed, and I see nothing but concerns with the saber rattling that's been going on with Marco Rubio wanting to take over Cuba, with the threats towards Mexico, the threats towards one of our greatest neighbors, Canada, and the threats to Greenland and what it would cause the NATO effect that's going on there. Brian, you want to talk about that from a global perspective?
Well, I think part of this is a lesson in short-sightedness. And the 2024 Nobel Prize winners in economics were, two economists and a political scientist from the US who had studied the effect of adherence to the rule of law in promotion of a sound economy. And of course, they studied the issue for centuries and found that by far, countries that promote and adhere to the rule of law and are seen to do so by other countries have the greatest foreign investment, and their economies thrive. Innovation there is notably better than it is in authoritarian regimes. So, I come back to the point about a myopic approach being taken here. And I'm concerned, and Stan has touched on it, about our children and grandchildren, because I think we're being myopic in, or perhaps some people are being myopic in their approach, because if America is ever seen as not adhering to the rule of law fully, or at least as much as other countries do, that whole concept of the moral leadership that I alluded to earlier will be compromised. And then investors may follow suit. What if Maduro is acquitted after all of this? What will that look like in the US and globally? It'll look like he was kidnapped. People won't use terms like extrajudicial rendition. They'll say he was kidnapped so that America could scoop up Venezuelan oil. And that will be a blow to the image of the US, a stain on its reputation that won't go away very soon. And I think that will impact on people's perception of the US as an adherent to the rule of law. And that's, of course, something that is a bedrock concern for the Academy. We are the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. And if America loses that stature, I think we all lose. That's a real concern I have. As a Canadian, I hear the rhetoric about the Monroe Doctrine. I hear about the 51st state. And, I see our government rightly turning to Europe, turning away from the US. And that's a matter of concern because of where we are and who we're closest to, not just in terms of physical proximity, but in terms of our values, our connections through relationships, all of that. We're very close to the US, and I hope that doesn't change.
Stan, what constitutional checks exist to stop the administration from doing what it did? Well, one, what constitutional stop signs did they run through? And two, what should Congress and what is Congress's role in this?
Well, that's a great question, Joe. And you and I have talked before, and I've talked on your podcast about my thoughts about how outdated and archaic our constitutional structure is. The answer is there's not a lot, but there are some. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. Now, the post-World War II experience with that has been to kind of, have police actions in Korea, in Vietnam, et cetera, try to kind of skirt around that. Eventually, the War Powers Act was adopted by Congress as a way to give interpretation to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And that's also been ignored or complied with only after the fact. There aren't a lot of stop signs, Joe, particularly when you have a Congress that is compliant. If you had a vigorous Senate and House asserting their constitutional authority and holding the executive to account for violations of its authority, there you would have some hope of controlling this. But our system makes it difficult to address these issues. They're often addressed after the fact when, for example, post-invasion of Kuwait, there was a war powers resolution that was brought forward that was voted on, that kind of thing. But the constitutional structure, I think, doesn't work very well to control an aggressive executive branch on this.
Let me go somewhere far afield here. What if it is determined in an international court that what the president has done violates international law? Brian, would the president ever have to appear in the international court and be charged with these crimes?
Never. And that's been the stance of Democrats. It's been the stance of Republicans. It's why the U.S. has never signed on to the Treaty of Rome. The U.S. is not a deterrent to the International Criminal Court. And, the U.S. has steadfastly maintained that position. Of course, there was a narrative back in my days as a law student that if the U.S. ever signed on to the treaty involving the International Criminal Court, that the first person in the prisoner's dock would be Henry Kissinger. and
Partly for the Chile coup. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. So in a sense, we've come full circle here. But the U.S. has never been, despite its support for the UN historically, it's never been a supporter of the international court system.
Well, Stan, you left me a little bit concerned, and maybe some of our listeners are sharing my same concern. You've almost suggested there's nothing that we can do as American citizens to stop the exercise of this power that the president has shown with his invasion and kidnapping, be it Cuba, be it Mexico, be it Greenland, be it Canada. That's a little unsettling, Stan. Make us feel better, please.
Sure. Well, let me say this. I do believe that our constitutional structures are not as robust as I would like them to be, and there's not as clear a framework as I would like. But we have the right of the First Amendment to speak out, to articulate positions, to put pressure on our congresspeople, on our senators, and to be heard by the administration. All of those things will make a difference. And most importantly, we have the right to vote in the upcoming elections to make our voice heard.
That's not making me feel good, Stan, because this is only a year into this administration. My concern is what may happen over the next 3 years, because this is not a crack in the dam. This is water overflowing the dam. What structures exist to stop this from continuing to happen?
Not enough structures, Joe. And I'm sorry to say that, but that's the truth. And for example, the impeachment provisions in the Constitution were somewhat intended to deal with an executive who was out of control. We've seen how difficult those are to actually enforce and make a difference. The bottom line is, if in the United States we have a president who wants to, under whatever justification, exercise excessive executive authority by invading countries, by doing things here and there, we have very few mechanisms to prevent that. The courts give us some hope, Joe, and courageous lawyers and judges across the country have stepped in where they could, occasionally with injunctions, more often with rulings about interpretation. But we've also seen, we have a U.S. Supreme Court now that is heavily biased to a particular point of view on things, particularly this whole issue of the unitary executive theory that they're developing, which is going to only empower this kind of thing. Ideally, in a perfect world, we would have a constitutional convention like many countries do, and give it another crack to try to modernize and streamline our Constitution. That's not going to happen.
It hasn't happened in almost 250 years, and I'm afraid it won't be happening anytime soon. Brian, I'm going to give you the last word before we sign off as we talk about what's going on here.
Well, it's dangerous to give me the last word, Joe, but I appreciate it. It's interesting to think about American constitutional law, and we do that in Canada. We respect the principles that were pioneered in America. And one of them has to do with the concern about excessive power at the center of government. The revolution was about getting rid of tyranny, and having appropriate checks and balances is what the Constitution has sought to do. Everyone knows that there's a compliant Congress now. You've asked about structures, and Stan has been forthright in his response. In my view, the ultimate safeguard, and I say this as someone looking warily across Lake Ontario from time to time, the appropriate safeguard here is exactly what the people wanted at the time of the American Revolution. They wanted a government for the people that would be responsible and that would be seen, as that passenger on the ship said, as the shining city on the hill. And I think that ultimately there's a chance that structures will be reformed, but ultimately it will be the people who say, no, we can't have a unitary executive. That's too much like tyranny. We need appropriate checks and balances. I have great faith in the American people. I think this can be overcome. I know there was talk at the time of the first Trump administration about the resiliency of American democracy. And I don't think that Stan or I are being especially Pollyanna-ish in saying that the power is with the people appropriately. It's a big country with a huge population, and democracy can be messy up close. We all appreciate, but ultimately, the old saying, "You are what you eat," and I think that the American people will have the appropriate concern about the rule of law here. And, in that sense, I think that's been the overall theme of our entire discussion. And I think that the right measure will be found, the right system of checks and balances, one way or another, will be found by the American people.
Well, I said I'd give you the last word, but I'm actually going to take the last word. And that is the rule of law must prevail at the end of the day. Second to that is democracy must prevail. And if this is what we voted for, this is what we're going to get. And that will be determined by the American people. So in that vein, I do agree, Brian, with what you and Stan have said. It's a question of whether or not the American people want this type of government and whether the American people want the rule of law to be respected. I'm going to end this episode, and I want to thank you two for spending a little bit of time with me to talk about this urgent issue. I'm Joe Tucker. I'm president of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and this has been the Rule of Law, the Academy Speaks. Thank you very much for listening. Take care.